Now we're joined by Daniel Ryntjes in Washington and, of course, Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg for more on this story. And I'll start with you, Daniel. Now, some commentators have compared Glencore to Lehmans and, of course, the Greek crisis, with some suggesting that Glencore could be worse off, especially looking at September's performance. Now, what are the chances we will see a downgrade of its debt rating?
Well, I've heard that the company's been telling analysts it doesn't see the possibility of a downgrade of its debt rating. But most in the market think that this is probably highly likely to happen, given the fact that it's so highly exposed to the commodity market and has so much debt on board. And the fact that, now it's trading in this sort of junk bond status to an extent. But I would caution that it's good to separate out the way that bonds are being traded and from whether the company itself is operationally and financially robust. Those were the words of the company in its most recent statement. So it is moving very hard to reassure the markets that the company is sound and therefore moving forward, there is not a threat to it.
I mean, like Angelo, over in South Africa, Glencore actually announced that it's cutting a further 340 jobs in South Africa and could possibly implement more cuts. Now, the company employs about 35,000 people in South Africa. How are the labor unions reacting to this news?
Well, they're not happy at the moment, least of all those unions. We're talking just generally in the mining sector. And the unions have been voicing their displeasure to the ex-Minister of Mineral Resources, Ramahlodi. Of course, Glencore hasn't been mincing its words and actions either. And the unions did complain at one point about the fact that Glencore wasn't following due process. And that's what led to the ex-mining minister suspending the Glencore optimum mining license and then obviously reinstating it a little while later. By the way, those 340 jobs are also in the coal sector, and the coal sector is under a fair amount of pressure at the moment. We heard today, while attending a different discussion, that there's a potential strike looming that could affect coal supply to Eskom, which is going to have a major issue in terms of the country's load shedding issues. Uche?
And Daniel, you mentioned earlier, of course, the company's been reassuring people that it's fine, but it has been reported that a quarter of its bonds and, of course, credit lines are due for refinancing in 6 or so months. Now, what are Glencore's options? Are they going to refinance, or are we going to see them delaying some of these deadlines?
Well, a lot of the financing that Glencore does is through something called a revolving line of credit. It's essentially a way in which the company has a sort of credit card from the bank, and it has many relationships with many banks over many years. So it has the ability to continue to lend from them, and there's no indication that these financial institutions are in any way likely to withdraw that kind of credit. So along with having about 5 or 6 billion US dollars of cash on hand, they also have a considerable amount of this rolling credit, which they can use when they need to. So bearing all that in mind, there's not really a threat in the next 6 months if things continue along the path. And I think the fundamental job is to convince investors and analysts that there is transparency in this company. The trading arm has been one area of concern that was mentioned in my package. And what the company's been doing is telling people, look at the detail, opening up the books, showing them how the business works, so they don't think there's any major exposure or financial contagion moving forward.
Well, Angelo, Glencore is one of the world's biggest commodity companies, and of course it's listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Is there any concern that that Glencore's woes could pose any type of systemic risk in South Africa or have an adverse effect on South Africa's economy?
Well, the bottom line here is Glencore's business here is relatively small in relation to its global footprint. I've been told by analysts that it makes a single-digit contribution to the group's turnover, so it's not a big deal. It's not the key risk to South Africa, I'm told. There are bigger problems here: labor militancy, regulatory uncertainty, and low commodity prices, as Daniel was referring to. The exposure in the platinum sector is also a concern. As you mentioned earlier, there's 1,000 jobs that are potentially going to be lost to from the Eland platinum mine. And remember also that the platinum price has been hammered from $1,280 around a year ago to closing near $922 today. So there are other issues here other than Glencore.
Well, thank you so much, Angelo, and of course, Daniel, for giving us those insights, of course, joining us from Washington and Johannesburg.